When you ask a person on the street to name a noir film, The Maltese Falcon is probably the title you'll hear most often. However, if you were to ask a noir fan to name the most noir picture out there, the one with the best combination of fame and success, visual design, writing, acting, and everything else, the two words you'll most likely hear are Double Indemnity. The story about the story. Throughout the decades when the Hollywood production code was enforced, studios were always pushing against the boundaries of censorship. You remember The Postman Always Rings Twice? MGM sat on the film rights for that book for years because the subject matter was so racy, and the only reason they decided to produce it finally is because of the success of Double Indemnity. Double Indemnity, released by Paramount in 1944, is about adultery and murder. And since it's the protagonists who engage in both, you can see why it might get the censors' attention. The movie was based on a novella by James M. Cain, the same man who authored Postman, which explains the similarities. And the screenplay was written by Billy Wilder, the director, with the help of Raymond Chandler, the guy who wrote that awesome dialogue in The Big Sleep. You'd almost think so many good authors collaborating on a single piece would turn a good work into garbage, but somehow everything just came together. The production did have some trouble getting actors to play the lead roles, mostly because nobody wanted to be associated with a pair of murderous adulterers. Still, they eventually found Fred MacMurray to be the leading man, and this is particularly interesting considering that his usual roles were easygoing comedies. Later in life, he would be a sitcom dad in My Three Sons, which ran for 12 years, and he was Ned Brainerd in Disney's Absent-Minded Professor. The fact that he was so good at playing a regular stand-up guy, and by all reports he was one in real life too, it was a brilliant piece of casting. He doesn't look like a murderous adulterer, and he's not supposed to. The role of leading lady, meanwhile, eventually went to Barbara Stanwyck, who had to be talked into it by Billy Wilder, but who was willing to try something new since she was getting up in years and needed to transition into different kinds of roles. To say that this paid off for her is an understatement, as her career continued going strong on into the late 50s. Also, for the record, Stanwyck was a natural brunette, and she wears an intentionally fake-looking wig throughout Double Indemnity. The story. We begin with our protagonist, Walter Neff, heading into the Pacific All Risk office, the insurance company where he works. He's moving very slowly and deliberately, and favoring his left arm, but it's not until he sits down at his desk that we see why. He got shot in the shoulder. Slowly, he loads a wax cylinder into his dictaphone and begins telling his story, making this the second noir I've covered to have a narrator. Neff is relating his confession of a murder. As he puts it, I did it for the money, and I did it for a woman. I didn't get the money, and I didn't get the woman. Neff's story begins with him going up to a house in the Los Angeles hills to talk with the owner, Mr. Diedrichson, about renewing his auto insurance. Turns out the man of the house isn't in, but his wife is, and she's in a bath towel because she was sunbathing. Neff appreciates the view. When she comes down later fully dressed, Neff is also rather entranced by her anklet. As Neff discusses insurance policies, Mrs. Phyllis Diedrichson asks him about accident insurance. He says that yes, they cover that, and then the two of them start flirting, using a traffic stop as a double entendre. She tells him to come back the next day at 8 p.m., so he heads back to the office. At the office, we meet the supporting protagonist, Barton Keyes. Keyes is, well, Double Indemnity is remarkably close to Columbo's format, and in large part it's because Keyes has a lot in common with Lieutenant Columbo. Keyes happens to be a remarkably good claims manager who gets gut feelings which tell him when a claim is phony. As Neff walks in, Keyes is turning down a claim for a burned-out truck because his gut feeling led him to evidence that proved the guy burned it himself. The scene is mostly just to establish Keyes as a character, and the only big plot moment is when Neff lights a match with his thumb for Keyes' cigar, which is both a running motif and a way for Fred McMurray to show off a neat trick. When Neff gets to his own office, he sees a letter from Phyllis. The letter asks him to come by on a Thursday afternoon instead of the next day at 8, and even though he knows he shouldn't, he goes along with it. When he gets to the house, Phyllis is there alone. Apparently, she thought that her husband would be there, but he's not. And coincidentally, it's the maid's day off. As soon as they sit down, Phyllis starts talking about accident insurance again. She says she's worried about all of the danger around the oil fields where her husband works. Neff suggests talking with Mr. Diedrichson about it, but Phyllis insists that he wouldn't agree. She then suggests that maybe she could take out a policy for her husband, without him knowing. But as soon as she says that, Neff realizes what she really means by it, and leaves. Unfortunately, much like in Postman, the attraction between Neff and Phyllis is too strong, and when she comes to his apartment at 8 o'clock, he lets her in. After a few words, they share an intense kiss, and then a glass of bourbon. Phyllis explains that she married her husband mostly to have a home, and also because she pitied him after his first wife died while she was her nurse. She also isn't fond of her daughter-in-law, Lola. Neff warns Phyllis against taking out a policy and then trying to pull something, but it gets him to thinking about how he occasionally wondered how to pull off the perfect insurance fraud. We cut to Neff narrating in the middle of this, and when we cut back, Neff and Phyllis are in different positions on the couch. Neff is having a cigarette, and Phyllis is fixing her makeup. It's a nice, subtle way of implying that the two just had sex off camera. In that time, Neff has also decided to help Phyllis. Neff starts by talking to Diedrichson about accident insurance in front of a witness, his daughter, Lola, and then tricking him into signing the application by calling it a duplicate. In the process, we find out that Diedrichson is heading to Palo Alto for a Stanford reunion, so Neff tells Phyllis to make him take the train. The policy has a double indemnity clause that pays double the cash payout, or $100,000 if the person covered dies on a train. Oh, and Neff also winds up giving a ride to Lola, who doesn't want her father to know she's seeing a man named Nino Zacchetti. Neff and Phyllis start having clandestine meetings at a food mart to work out the details. During one of these meetings, Phyllis says that Diedrichson broke his leg and won't be going to Stanford. So Neff says they'll just have to wait, no matter how antsy Phyllis is getting. A week later, Keyes comes into Neff's office and offers to make him his assistant. That's when Phyllis calls and says the trip to Stanford is back on. He'll be on crutches, but he could make it. So Neff gets the color of his suit from her and then heads out to establish his alibi. He makes sure the man in his apartment garage sees him parking. He calls a coworker to get some information he could supposedly work on through the evening. He sticks bits of paper into the phone and doorbells to let him know if someone tried to contact him, and he walks to the Diedrichson house and sneaks into their car. And on the way to the station, Neff kills Diedrichson. Once they get there, Neff uses Diedrichson's crutches and a roll of bandages to fake a cast, and Phyllis runs interference so that none of the train staff can get a good look at him. Neff runs into some trouble when he finds a man named Jackson on the observation deck, but he manages to talk Jackson into going back into the train to get something for him, long enough to jump off the back. Phyllis is already waiting for him, and so they drag Diedrichson's body out to the tracks, experience a little car trouble, and then leave. 2 days pass, and the insurance company's boss, Mr. Norton, brings Neff and Keyes in to talk about the case. Keyes doesn't have so much as a hunch, but that's not acceptable to Mr. Norton. He suspects suicide of all things, and he brings Phyllis in to grill her on whether her husband had been feeling depressed. However, Phyllis acts offended and storms out. Keyes then explains why his boss is wrong by listing off all the statistical reasons why it's unlikely a man would try to commit suicide by jumping off the back of a slow-moving train. That evening, Phyllis goes to meet with Neff, but before she gets there, Keyes shows up. Turns out that his gut feeling is back because Diedrichson didn't use his accident insurance to make a claim on his broken leg. Plus, the timing of the accident is just too coincidental. There's a particularly tense moment where Phyllis has to hide behind Neff's door, and after that, Neff insists that Phyllis can't see him anymore since Keyes is going to have her shadowed. Later on, Lola comes to visit Neff to talk about her real mother, and how, while she was sick with pneumonia, her nurse, Phyllis, apparently removed her bed covers and opened the windows while no one was looking. And that's not how you take care of someone with a fever. I mean, you shouldn't bundle them up too much, but exposure to the elements is also pretty bad. Lola also noticed Phyllis trying on her mourning outfit 2 days before her father died. Neff's response is to take her out to dinner and then the beach, so that she'll forget about telling other people what she saw. A couple of days later, Keyes brings Neff into his office. Keyes has figured out that Diedrichson was never on the train, that someone else took his place so that they could plant the body later, and he's brought in the man on the observation deck, Jackson, to confirm that the man he saw wasn't the man who died. Neff is quite naturally nervous around Jackson, but he doesn't recognize him. Still, Keyes now knows that Phyllis had a partner in crime. Neff and Phyllis meet again in the food mart, and Neff says it's time to walk away from the insurance money and avoid suing so that Keyes can't bring his evidence to court. Neff says it's to protect both their necks, but Phyllis thinks it's because he's feeling sorry for Lola, whom he's continued to date. She refuses to back down now. Later on, Neff and Lola go up into the hills near the Hollywood Bowl, and Lola says that she suspects her old beau, Nino. Nino has been going in and out of Phyllis's house recently, and she thinks he only dated her as a blind. Plus, he has no alibi for the night of the murder. The next day, Keyes tells Neff that he's found the other guy Phyllis was working with, and Neff suspects he's playing with him. As such, he sneaks into Keyes' office and finds out from his dictaphone that Neff was a suspect, but Keyes prefers Nino Zucchetti as the perp. Seeing a way out, Neff calls Phyllis and arranges to meet her at her house at 11 p.m. When he gets there, Neff tells Phyllis that he's getting out now while he still can, and he accuses her of using him just because he knows a little about insurance. She might have been masterminding things with Zucchetti all along, or she might not have, but to him, it no longer matters. Still, she clarifies that she was working on Zucchetti to build him into a jealous rage against Lola so that he'd remove that particular problem for her. Now, before Neff can probably strangle Phyllis so he can pin it on Zucchetti, who will be arriving soon after with the police, Phyllis pulls a gun and shoots Neff in the shoulder. She only missed the vitals, by the way, because it was dark. And since this is a movie and not real life, Neff's response to getting shot is smarmy sarcasm rather than falling over or crying out in pain. He barely even flinches. As Neff approaches Phyllis, she lowers the gun and admits that she was using him, and everyone. But she realized she was in love with Neff because she couldn't fire that second shot. It's hard to say if she's lying here or not, mostly because Neff doesn't take any chances and shoots her twice with her own gun. At this point, we've caught up to where the narration begins. Turns out Keyes showed up at some point during the confession thanks to a tip from the porter, who saw blood on the tile. Keyes wants to call a doctor, but Neff would rather try to get to Mexico, or at least bleed out on his own. Of course, by this point, Neff has lost so much blood that he doesn't even manage to get out the office front door, and Keyes calls an ambulance anyway. As Keyes lights Neff's cigarette, reversing the usual order of things. The movie ends, leaving things ambiguous as to whether Neff dies there or dies in the gas chamber. Final thoughts. You know, there's something else I've been talking around rather than about, and that would be the Hays Code. See, here's the thing about early motion pictures. They weren't covered by the First Amendment. Censorship was all the rage a century ago, and various states had censorship boards which would shut down play productions, ban books from store shelves and libraries, and revoke the licenses of movie theaters which displayed films without getting the board's approval first. And to top it all off, in 1915, the Supreme Court declared 9-0 that motion pictures were too much of a for-profit business to be worthy of First Amendment protections. I guess they just weren't paying attention to the cutthroat competition going on at the time between the also-for-profit newspapers. Anyway, this ruling meant that state censorship boards could keep growing, and it also meant that banned films were cutting into studio profit margins. And keep in mind that they were buying up theater chains like crazy at this point. If a censorship board revoked a theater's license, it was a total loss to the studio. They managed to keep things informal for a while by avoiding the most obvious pitfalls and making up for the losses thanks to the immense profits they were getting from a new form of media. But in the 1920s, the concept of Hollywood excess began to appear, and it forced the studios onto the defensive. In 1922, they formed a lobbying group named the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA, and they hired the Washington politician William H. Hays to be their chief lobbyist. In this capacity, he created a list of don'ts and be carefuls based on what the censorship boards were most likely to look for. In 1930, the advent of talkies got the censors to start paying attention again, leading to the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code because of where it came from. At first, few films bothered to abide by it, but then in 1934, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish organizations got together and started boycotting Hollywood films in the middle of the Great Depression. With their very survival on the line, the studios agreed to start enforcing the production code. All except for United Artists, of course. Because, well, it's United Artists. But even they would tone things down during the 30s and 40s, since the state censorship boards were still alive and well. In 1952, thanks to an uncensored Italian short film named of all things The Miracle, the Supreme Court reversed their earlier decision, again with a unanimous vote, and they declared that motion pictures were a protected medium for free speech, marking the beginning of the end of the censorship era. The end of the studio system also helped, since it meant that cinemas and cinema chains were free to show any movies they wanted to, and the state censorship boards were losing the power to stop them. By the early 60s, the production code was defunct, and by the late 60s, the MPPDA, now known as the MPAA, instituted a rating system to replace the code. It's just as arbitrary as the old censorship rules ever were, but at least now it's a guideline rather than an absolute restriction. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a famous film that's vaguely based on an equally famous serial killer.